You complain when your alarm goes off too early. You complain about a long commute, a demanding boss, a schedule that leaves no room to breathe. It feels unfair sometimes, like your time isn't really your own. Now imagine none of your time was ever your own. Not your labor, not your body, not even your name. That was the daily reality for a staggering number of people in the ancient world. And the real answer for what that life actually looked like isn't what most people picture. It's far stranger, far more varied, and in some ways far more brutal than the simple image in your head. Start with the basics, because even those defy what you'd expect. Slavery in the ancient world wasn't one thing. It wasn't a single fixed condition, the way modern textbooks sometimes flatten it into a single sentence. In ancient Rome alone, historians estimate that slaves made up somewhere between 10 and 30% of the entire population, depending on the region and time period. In some households, slaves outnumbered free citizens. The historian Keith Bradley, who has spent decades studying Roman slavery, points out something unsettling. Slavery wasn't a footnote in ancient society. It was the engine running underneath almost everything. So how did you become a slave in the first place? Not through one path, through several, and none of them required you to have done anything wrong. War was the biggest source. Lose a battle, and the victors didn't just take territory, they took people. Entire populations of conquered cities could be enslaved overnight, men, women, and children alike. Piracy was another. Mediterranean waters were thick with slave traders who kidnapped travelers, sailors, even entire villages along the coast, and sold them at ports built specifically for this purpose. And then there was debt. If you couldn't pay what you owed, in many ancient societies, your body became the collateral. You or your children could be sold to settle the balance. Being born into it was the final path, and often the most common. If your mother was enslaved, you were born enslaved too, regardless of who your father was. Freedom wasn't inherited, bondage was. Now picture the moment itself. You're standing on a raised platform in a crowded market square. Buyers circle you, inspecting your teeth, your muscles, your posture, the same way they'd inspect livestock. Auctioneers hung signs around slaves' necks listing their skills, their health, their perceived flaws. Everything about you distilled into a placard for strangers to read. Once purchased, your daily life depended entirely on the whim of whoever bought you, and the range was staggering. If you were enslaved in a Roman household, your work might mean cooking, cleaning, raising your owner's children, managing correspondence, or even tutoring their sons in Greek philosophy. Educated slaves were common and sometimes deeply trusted, but if you were sent to the mines, or the galleys, or the latifundia, the massive agricultural estates that fed entire cities, your life expectancy dropped catastrophically. Historians estimate that slaves working the silver mines near ancient Athens often didn't survive more than a few years underground. The sociologist Orlando Patterson, in his influential study of slavery across dozens of societies, described this condition with a phrase that still unsettles people today. He called it social death. Not because slaves were treated as literally dead, but because they existed with no legal identity, no family recognized by law, no future they were permitted to plan for themselves. You could be sold away from your spouse. Your children could be sold away from you. None of it required a reason, a warning, or your consent. And yet, here's where the picture gets stranger than you'd expect. Not all slavery looked the same, and not all slaves lived the same kind of life. In some periods of Roman history, educated Greek slaves working as household tutors, doctors, or accountants lived in relative comfort, sometimes better fed and housed than poor free citizens outside the household. Some slaves managed businesses on behalf of their owners, handled money, negotiated deals, and accumulated what was called a peculium, a kind of personal fund technically owned by the master, but often functionally controlled by the slave. With that peculium, some slaves actually purchased their own freedom. Manumission, the formal act of freeing a slave, was surprisingly common in Roman society, more common than in almost any other slaveholding culture in history. Once freed, a former slave in Rome became what was called a freedman, gaining Roman citizenship, though social stigma still followed for at least a generation. So the true picture isn't simple brutality across the board, though brutality was constant and real for enormous numbers of people. It's something closer to a spectrum, stretching from horrific, short, grinding labor in mines and fields to households where a slave might hold real influence, real skill, and even a narrow, fragile path toward freedom. But don't let that spectrum soften what sat underneath all of it. Even the most comfortable position in that spectrum still meant you were legally property. You could be sold, beaten, or killed by your owner in many jurisdictions with little to no legal consequence. Roman law technically limited excessive cruelty towards slaves over time, but enforcement was inconsistent and depended entirely on which magistrate happened to be paying attention that year. Ancient sources describe punishments ranging from whipping to branding to crucifixion, the last one reserved specifically, almost exclusively, for slaves who rebelled or fled. It was meant as a public warning, not just a punishment, and that fear of rebellion wasn't paranoid imagination, it was justified. The largest slave uprising in Roman history, led by a man named Spartacus, involved tens of thousands of enslaved people fighting Roman legions for nearly 2 years before being crushed. Rome's response afterward tells you everything about how deeply this fear ran. 6,000 captured rebels were crucified along the Appian Way, a single road stretching for well over 100 miles, each cross placed close enough that travelers couldn't avoid seeing them. That wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was a message, engineered with brutal precision, meant to remind every enslaved person in the region exactly what awaited resistance. So when you step back and look at the full shape of ancient slavery, you start to see why historians resist reducing it to a single image. It wasn't the plantation-style slavery many people picture from more recent history, though forced agricultural labor was very real and often just as deadly. It was closer to an entire, sprawling economic and social system woven into households, mines, farms, government offices, and even intellectual life, with millions of individual human beings living somewhere on a spectrum between grinding brutality and cautious conditional privilege, but never, at any point, with full control over their own lives. Here's the part that should genuinely sit with you. This wasn't ancient history's dark exception. For long stretches of the ancient world, slavery wasn't hidden away or treated as shameful. It was normal, woven into daily conversation, daily labor, daily commerce, as unremarkable to most free citizens as employment contracts are to you today. People bought and sold human beings the way you might browse listings for used furniture. Owning people wasn't a moral question most ancient citizens spent much time wrestling with. It was simply how their world worked. So the next time your alarm goes off too early, or your boss sends one more demanding email, or your schedule feels impossibly tight, remember what that frustration actually rests on. The ability to complain about your time at all means, at the most basic level, that your time belongs to you. For a staggering number of people who lived before you, on the same soil, breathing the same air, that was never true. Not for a single day of their lives. The more we learn about the past, the better we understand ourselves. If this video sparked your curiosity, don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow Phoenix Primeval for more fascinating stories from history, science, and human evolution. Thanks for watching.